Good afternoon, everyone. To those joining on Facebook, hello and welcome. To those on Zoom, also welcome. Today's class is the final session of Poverty, Individuals and Communities, Perspectives in Jewish Law and Thought with Dr. Alyssa Gray. It's been a pleasure to learn with Dr. Gray these past 3 weeks, and look forward to and if you are just tuning in for the first time, we have recordings of this series on our Facebook videos. Source sheets for today's class will be shared in chat in both Zoom and Facebook Live. So, and if you have questions, feel free to ask in chat. They will both streams will have their chats monitored. If you want to speak out, that's great. Shoot me a message, ask in chat. Feel free. Dr. Ray, do you want a little more introduction? Any more introduction or?
Nope, we're good to go.
All right.
Ready?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. As Kayla said, today is kind of our grand finale. Just to remind us of where we've been. 2 weeks ago, we started on November 3rd with poverty, its emotional, physical, and spiritual ill effects. Last week on November 10th, we took a closer look at the working poor and captives. And today we're going to look at mitigating the us and them mentality. Our session today is going to break down into two uneven parts. The first part will explore the rabbinic construction of what I'm calling the us and them mentality, rabbinic perceptions of the wealthy's treatment of the poor, what I call the angry poor, or rabbinic constructions of reactions of the poor to their plight. And then we'll get into what I'm calling, not what the sources are calling, but what I'm calling some mitigation strategies for alleviating this us and them mentality. And I'll say more about that as we get to it. So to start right off, the first three sources on page 1, sources 1, 2, and 3, rabbinic perceptions of the wealthy's treatment of the poor. I mean, some of these look rather ripped from some very nasty headlines. We'll begin with source 1 from the Talmud Yerushalmi in Masechet Brachot. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, the Amora, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, what happens? Basar vadam yesh lo karov. The human being has a relative. Im haya ashir hu modebo. If the relative is wealthy, oh, I'm related to that person. I'm happy to be associated with that person. V'im haya ani kofer bo. But if this relative is impoverished, I don't know. I never met her. I don't know who she is. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu eino kain. Says Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, but the Holy Blessed One is not like this. Ela afilu Yisrael nitunin b'yeridah hatachtona. Even if Israel has sunk to the lowest point, what does God do? God calls all Jews achai v're'ai, my brothers, my siblings, and my friends. And the proof text is Psalms 122:8. Lama'an achai v're'ai. Consider yourself lucky that I'm not going to burst into the melody that is associated with those words, as some may know the melody. The second source continues along this line. It's from Leviticus Rabbah, Parashah 34, Lamed Daled. As I've said previously, for those of you who are interested in looking at a place where in classical rabbinic literature there is a collection of material on poverty and charity, and you're interested in Midrash, Leviticus Rabbah, Parashah Lamed Daled 34 is a great place to look. And here you'll notice there's a pattern emerging. Source 1 is the Talmud Yerushalmi, the literature of the land of Israel. Leviticus Rabbah is a contemporaneous work from the land of Israel. Here we're getting expositions of Proverbs chapter 11, verse 17. Davar Acher, another interpretation. This source too is one of a series of interpretations. Gomel Nafsho Ish Chesed, the merciful man does good to his own soul. And continuing with the verse, the interpretation of Rabbi Alexandria is, what are we talking about? The merciful man does good to his own soul, but he that is cruel troubles his own flesh. He says, who is this that is cruel and troubles his own flesh? Zeh shehigia lo simcha. A person has a simcha, ve'eno medavek et krovav imo l'shem aniyut. He does not associate his relatives because of their poverty. Again, the syndrome of who are these people? I don't know who these people are. I'm having a party. I want to impress people. I want all the right people there. I don't want my poor relatives there. Again, bringing these sources to demonstrate the rabbi's awareness and construction of the existence of this us and them mentality. Then we get a particularly nasty example in source 3, also, of course, from Leviticus Rabbah. Here, it's part of a series of expositions of Proverbs chapter 29, verse 3. A rather odd verse, the wording is odd, which opens it up to multiple midrashic interpretations. Rash ve'ish techachim nifgashu, the poor person, the medium person, the ish techachim, like toch, the person in the middle, meet. And the Lord gives light to the eyes of them both, looking at the entire verse in English. This interpretation, poor, applies to what? Rash min hanechasim, a person who is poor in property. The ish techachim, the medium person, zeh shehu oseh b'pe'ulah, this is the person who literally does things, who does activities, who makes a living. And what happens if the rich man says to the same poor man, why don't you get a job? Go and get food. In other words, the implied point is, don't ask me for tzedakah. Don't be waiting on me to give tzedakah. Go get a job. Look at you. What's wrong with you? There's nothing wrong with you physically. Chami shakim, sort of look at those hips, look at those legs. Chami karin, chami kafadyan, look at this. You're perfectly hale and hearty. Go get a job. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this attitude, of course, is not pleasing to God. The Holy Blessed One says, Lo dayecha shalo natata lo mishalcha. Is it not enough for you that you didn't give this person from what is your own? In other words, you didn't give this person tzedakah or any kind of support. Ela bama shenatati lo. But what God gave to this person, sort of a robust physical constitution, atan machnis bo ayin ra'ah. You're sort of casting an evil eye on it. But again, sort of the stark realism of this source 3, the notion that the person, the rich person, or the person who is relatively rich, at least as compared to the Rash, which, as we saw 2 weeks ago on November 3rd, is one of the 7 terms that the rabbis derive from the Tanakh for the poor person, looking at the poor person and saying, what's with you? There must be a laziness here. There must be something wrong with your motivation, because clearly there's nothing stopping you from getting a job and supporting yourself. Then when we turn the page, we see that some can give as good as they get. So beginning in source 4, we have what I call the angry poor, the rabbi's constructions that we don't necessarily simply have silent passivity, but the rabbi's construction of what is very humanly understandable, the reactions of the poor. And again, surprise, surprise, in source 4, we're still in Vayikra Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, Parashah Lamed Daled. Here the verse for interpretation is Isaiah 58:12. And Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Simon says, the poor man, the ani hazeh yoshev umitraim, sits and complains. Ma ani uma ploni. Basically, how am I different from ploni? What am I, literally, ma ani, what am I, uma ploni, and what is ploni? Ploni yoshev beveito, ani yoshev likan. Ploni is sitting in his nice house, and I'm sitting here, presumably not a nice place. Ploni yashen al mitato. Ploni sleeps in his nice bed, but ani yashen al haaretz. I'm sleeping on the ground. V'amadata atava natatalo. This continues when you step up, when you stand up, v'amadata, and you give to this person. Ma'aleh, and you give this person tzedakah, in other words, ma'aleh ani alecha. This is, of course, the rabbi putting words in God's mouth, as it were. I, God, accounted to you, ke'ilu natata shalom beini leveino, says God. This is really somewhat remarkable. I counted to you as if you made peace between me and that poor person. In other words, the poor person is complaining. The poor person feels unjustly treated by God. The poor person feels that God has let them down. And by the person stepping up to give tzedakah and sort of trying to equalize the playing field, even in the slightest sense, God says, oh, you made peace, dichtiv, and then citing Isaiah 27:5, Ya'aseh shalom li. Focusing on those last words, he, the giver of tzedakah, will make, Ya'aseh, shalom li, peace with me. This, by the way, in source 4, I can't resist pointing out, indicates it's sort of an open door. If we had 3 more sessions, 2 more sessions to explore really the role of God, the role that the rabbis assign God in all of this, and the theological implications of God and poverty. We've touched on it briefly 2 weeks ago, the November 3rd session. There was some involvement of God. We see it here, but it is interesting to see how God sort of portrays God's self as someone who the poor person sees as being hostile, and the giver of tzedakah really being a peacemaker between the poor person and God. The next source is one where the angry poor are sort of hidden. The reason I say that, the reason I say hidden, is because that's really not what the source is about, which makes it all the more interesting. When you see a little bit of this motif, it's interesting because the source is really about something else. The source is really about Rabbi Eliezer, and Eliezer is short for Eliezer. It's the same name, from the Talmud Yerushalmi and Tractate Peah, the latter part of the tractate, which deals with tzedakah. And it's really about the hesitation of the rabbi to be a parnas, to be a communal official who is responsible, among other things, for welfare for the poor. But what's interesting is to see some of the portrayal of the poor in the story about the rabbi. He was a parnas. One time he went down to his house and he said to them, "What did you all do today?" And they said to him, "Well, a group of people came in, atachad siyah, one particular group of the poor came, they ate and drank, but salun alach, and they prayed for you." So Rabbi Eliezer is a communal functionary. He may not be home all day, but one of his responsibilities is to provide for the needy, and the people of his household see to it while he's away. Okay, they came, ate, drank, and prayed for you. And then what does he say? Leka agar tav. There is no good reward. In other words, okay, it's good to hear, but nah, there's no good reward for me in that. This came about a second time. He came home and he said, what happened today? And his household said to him, atachad siyah chori. Another group came. It was another day. Today, v'achlun v'shatun, they ate and drank. Great. V'achlunach, they cursed you. They ate, they drank, and they cursed you. Here now he says, Amar alun kadun ika agartav. In this situation, there is a good reward. I'm less interested right now in the issue of why Rabbi Eliezer is interested in being cursed. And if you continue in the source, you'll see that there's a description of the famous Rabbi Akiva having a similar thing. But it's the notion that there's a group of the poor. One group ate, drank, and blessed him. Another group ate, drank, and cursed him. In other words, people are human beings. Everyone's human. That not everyone is going to run themselves ragged, demonstrating gratefulness, gratitude to someone's generosity. There is a certain anger here. Clearly, the story doesn't tell us specifically where the anger comes from, but when we put this source together with some other sources, we could see the picture that the rabbis are perfectly well aware that human beings being what we all are, there is great dissatisfaction, anger, resentment that people will have at the straitened circumstances of their life. Poverty is not seen by the rabbis the way it might be in some other religious traditions as being something that's inherently ennobling or as conferring some type of sainthood. It's not that that is completely absent. There are sources that deal with that, but that recognition of the humanity here and of the resentment is very interesting. Apropos, I'm rounding out this section by jumping ahead chronologically to a comment that Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Mechaber, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, makes in his Beit Yosef. And he makes this comment in his work on Tur Choshen Mishpat 1, the beginning of the fourth part of the Arba'a Turim, where there's some discussion. The Arba'a Turim initiates discussion there in chapter 1 of Choshen Mishpat, comparing different passages of Pirkei Avot. Here, Avot 118, I'm in source 6 at the bottom of page 2. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says the world endures on truth, judgment, truth, and peace. And then Rabbi Karo makes an interesting comment because, again, there are two passages being compared here, which is a little beyond our pay grade today. He says, peace, shalom, in the one passage corresponds to gemilut chasadim in Mishnah Avot 1:2. Why does peace, shalom, correspond to gemilut chasadim? Because he says peace will come about because of gemilut chasadim. Because were it not for gemilut chasadim, for acts of kindness, for reciprocal acts of kindness that people do for each other, the poor would commit robbery. He says, she'im lo kein ha'ani yigzol. The poor would commit robbery. And he says this is the way Isaiah 27:5 should be interpreted. Isaiah 27:5, we just saw it above in source 4, the verse that particular passage closes on. And he says this is the way to interpret that verse, Ya'aseh shalom li, that the person who engages in gemilut chasadim creates peace for me meaning God. He says this is the way to understand it. The one who gives tzedakah to the poor brings about peace. For were it not for the tzedakah, the poor would commit robbery. The victim would similarly respond with some sort of violence, and he uses another biblical verse, 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 5, to show that. In other words, there'd be societal breakdown. So again, going to Isaiah 27:5, the notion that the person who does gemilut chasadim, acts of kindness, which is a category broader than tzedakah, it includes but is not limited to tzedakah, again creates peace between God and that person, but also, says Rabbi Karo, that person, by doing acts of gemilut chasadim, creates social peace. Social peace is created as well. And apropos this motif of the angry poor, the assumption that the poor will rob. I mean, they're going to need support. If they don't get it one way, they may be in such desperate straits, they look for another way to get it. The victims of robbery, of theft, may respond in kind, and you're going to have a societal breakdown. So now that we're all suitably depressed, we've seen this presentation of the us and them mentality and different rabbinic constructions of this gap. We're ready to sort of move to, well, what do they propose to do about it? What can we do about it? I mean, we've already seen some indication, but what do we do about it? And here I just want to start briefly with source 7, which is a passage from the Margoliot edition of Sefer Hasidim, which sheds a certain light on the importance of communal cohesiveness. In the interest of time, I don't really want to go through the entire thing, but when it comes to, I'll point to something in the second paragraph. When the community has to give tzedakah, and here's Sefer Hasidim in the 12th, 13th century in what is now Germany. We're talking, of course, about a medieval context in which the community may impose internally a cherem, a type of ban, which imposes a very serious, it's related to the law of vows, a very serious religious obligation on everyone in the community to give tzedakah. So there might be a certain campaign, so everyone is under the cherem. And then, of course, the question comes, well, should everybody really be under the cherem? I could understand why people with means should be within the ban to give tzedakah, but why? What about more impoverished people? So leaving aside the beginning of the passage about the gifts to the priests, He says, similarly, when the community has to give tzedakah, even if there are poor people who live in straitened circumstances, we place a ban, a chayrim, that everyone must give thus and such, even though it's not appropriate. And I would add, seems odd that a poor person should give to the benefit of other poor. Sometimes the poor who's giving is more impoverished than the recipient. But to make a long story short, if we start exempting people from the ban and start creating categories of people who don't have to give, things might cascade. There might be a snowball effect, and you'll have people looking for reasons that they also should not give. And then in the Hebrew, and then in the English, v'chol inyan hakahal mivutal. The entire, what I've called here, the concept of the community will be destroyed. Ultimately, many more people will suffer if we start exempting people from the ban than if we include everyone. And therefore, the passage, as I've quoted it here, ends, it's better that the poor also give and be included. But what do? Give it back to them in secret. In other words, have everybody give. And if a person really is too impoverished to give, you give it back to them. But the point is, the community has to be cohesive. The community has to be together, because if we start, now I'm certainly using my language, not the language I translated from the text. If we start kind of codifying this difference of status in the way we go about trying to enforce communal obligations, we are going to ultimately dissolve the concept of the community. Okay, so then what is it that we're doing? What are these strategies? As I said before, I'm calling them strategies. The scholars in these sources, whether it's Hazal, the Talmudic sages, or the rishonim, the medieval scholars, but they're not calling them strategies. But I'm looking at these halachot and I'm thinking to myself, what might the effect of these halachot be? And sort of working backwards, thinking about what might the impact, hopefully a salutary impact, on communal cohesiveness be from these particular halachot. So here on page 3, we have what I call strategy 1, limiting the economic power of the wealthy over the poor. Page 5, I have strategy 2, as I've called it, trying to contain the influence of wealth. Also on page 5, strategy 3, modesty in expenditures. Strategy 4 on page 6, one which I personally find very interesting, the poor's religious obligations as Jews and as members of their communities. And as we'll see in due course, I have some subcategories there. And then strategy 5 on page 10, a theological, an old theological idea. So strategy 1, limiting the economic power of the wealthy over the poor. And here we have a passage found in the 13th century halachic work from Central Europe, the Or Zarua. The passage is also found elsewhere. I happen to like this particular text of the passage the best, so I brought it here. And it illustrates this, particularly not just the passage itself, but how Rabbi Caro, the Mechaber, later codifies this in the Shulchan Aruch, sort of illustrating, limiting the economic power of the wealthy over the poor. If we turn to page 4, I'll focus on the English. It once happened that there was a certain poor person who already owed money. Surprise, surprise. I mean, the person has had to borrow money. So he owes his creditors a maneh. It's a lot of money. It's basically half of what in the rabbinic conception would support him and his family in a year. He had need of other people. That's a rabbinic expression, meaning he is poor, he seeks tzedakah, and he pursued his sustenance. In other words, he sought and received tzedakah until he accumulated 2 manehs. Great. That'll be the amount that could support him and his family for the year. What happens? The creditor says, aha, you have 2 manehs, you owe me 1, give me 1. And the debtor responds to him. And this is interesting to me because I'm always interested in finding the voice of the poor. And he says, lo, no, rachamu alai, have mercy on me. Ki im lefarnes b'nei veiti v'lo lifroa et chovi. Basically, the purpose for which I collected this tzedakah was to support my family, not to pay off my debt. So here we have the legal question. Does the person have to give this amount, even though it was collected as tzedakah? Does he have to give the money to the creditors or not? And the author of the Or Zarua in the 13th century begins by quoting the machloket, the dispute about this, in an earlier generation. It was not breaking news for the author of the Or Zarua in the 13th century. The Ra'avia, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi, a prominent German scholar of the 12th century, the late 12th century, exempted him. In other words, he did not have to give that money to the creditor. And Rabbeinu Simcha of Speyer, obligated him. He had to give the money to the creditor. And the reason is there. Tzedakah is like any other gift, unless there was a stipulation by the giver of the gift that it was to be used for purpose X and not for purpose Y. If there was no such stipulation, then there's no reason not to use the money to pay off the creditor. The author of the Or Zarua is nice and humble. He has less reason to be humble than many of us, but he's nice and humble. He says here on page 4, as for me, the author, I'm unworthy to place my head between the two great mountains. In other words, who am I to try to decide this dispute between the Ra'avia and Rabbeinu Simcha, but I will. I agree with the Ra'avia, he says. The debtor cannot pay his debt from tzedakah monies that he collected from others. No, he collected 2 manes worth of tzedakah. He may owe 1. He keeps the 2. Why? For certainly we take notice. The giver didn't give with the intention that the debtor would give the funds to the rich. Had the giver known that the money would go to a creditor, he might not have given it. And he says, furthermore, he talks a bit about tzedakah, the merit of tzedakah. I just want to jump there on page 4 to the part about that the giver of the tzedakah gave with the intention that the family, the wife and children, would be supported for the tzedakah. He says, even if the poor man has a obligation to the creditor, the wife and children have they know nothing about the creditor. And therefore, he should be able to keep all of the tzedakah. I like, what the Or Zarua says. It's very interesting. This continues, by the way, to royal as a machloket, certainly as a theoretical matter, as centuries go on. In source 9 on page 4, the Shulchan Aruch codifies, as lawyers would say, the holding, sort of codifies the bottom line, and says, and uses passive voice in a very interesting way, Ein ba'alei chovot yecholim lehipara. Creditors cannot be paid. And I'll say something about that, and then I'll look, see there's a comment in the chat. I'll just say what I like about the passive voice is that the mechaber deals with a certain situation. What if the poor person wanted to pay the debt with the tzedakah? Okay, granted, maybe we're not going to allow the creditors to take him to court, but what if he wanted to do it? The mechaber's use of the passive voice is elegant because it implies not only can't the creditor take the money by force, but the poor person presumably cannot choose to give it in a voluntary way. And here again, I'm looking at this, it's nobody's conscious idea of a strategy, but particularly given Rabbi Caro's codification, we see a certain limitation here of the economic power of the wealthy over the poor. Not every debtor, not every dollar that the debtor is able to put together for the support of their family automatically has to be turned over to creditors that are owed the money. Yes, Naomi makes an interesting point, and I would just point out that there is more to this. I mean, there are later the Gaon of Vilna in the 18th century disagreed with Rabbi Caro in the 16th century. I mean, there are some other disputes here. I'm not just sort of responding a little bit on one foot. I can't think off the bat of someone who made the precise suggestion you do, but there were people who thought that Simcha of Speyer, who said that the poor person was obligated, in fact, had the better of the argument. And then, of course, nobody's assuming that the entire debt necessarily would be paid off at once, but it is very interesting. And it says something here, particularly about Rabbi Caro, and his approach to the poor, which is something about which I've written in the past. He tends to be very lenient, very poor-centric, shall we say, if I could coin an inelegant word on the fly in many of his rulings, and we'll see a little more of that later. On page 5, we get to the second strategy, quote unquote, trying to contain the influence of wealth. And here I've brought a source from the Arba'at Turim, the major code in the 14th century, Spain, Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, chapter 9 of Chosh and Mishpat. And this is part of Hilchot Dayanim, the laws of judges. And here, this is interesting. He quotes an earlier scholar, Rabbi Yehuda al-Bartzaloni, who wrote, basically the question is, how do we pay the judges? How do judges, where do their salaries come from? And he says, Nohagu barov mekomot, they are accustomed in most places, la'asot leveit din kupa, to have a communal fund for the Beit Din, sheposkin mazon Beit Din ufarnasatam, lechama ola b'shana. However much it costs during the year in order to provide a living for them. And they collected at the beginning or the end. There's no element here because it's a communal fund. You're collecting from everybody. This is not a bribe to the judges. It's no fee for service type of thing. Why? All of Israel is obligated to support judges and sages. And he goes on to say, Yehuda al-Bartzaloni, that people can make free will donations to this fund. And then the key for our purposes is what I bolded in both languages. Ein srichin hadayanin. The advantage of having this fund is that ein srichin hadayanin letroach lechach. The judges don't have to work hard to get this. They don't have to request anything from anybody. So that they're not beholden to anybody. They don't have to, they don't have to flatter anybody, again, to be beholden to anybody. Rather, this is a davar katsuv hu al hatzibor. This is a communal obligation. And again, the judge doesn't have to be beholden to anyone. And I bring that up here because, again, part of the problems that we see in the creation of an us and them mentality, the creation of gaps in society, is the inevitable dynamic that occurs when wealth begins to have influence in areas where it should not have influence, it's hard to prevent. It's something about which there has to be vigilance. And here the concern that if there isn't such a communal fund in which people pay on an obligatory basis, yes, if people want to make donations to the fund, that's fine, but it's a communal fund. You don't have person X personally supporting the household of Judge Y. Judge on the Beit Din Y is the personal product wearing the t-shirt, the jersey, and carrying the swag of person X in the community. We don't want this to be. There has to be, of course, people need to be supported, but it has to be done in the way that there will be absolutely no concern that the expenditure of wealth will have an impact on the administration of justice. On page 5, we have what I've called strategy 3, and this is modesty in expenditures. This is also a topic that, had we whirled enough in time, could be a subject all by itself. Here, my first source on this, source 11, comes from the Talmud Bavli, the literature of Hazal, the sages. There are, when you move into the Middle Ages and later, there are Jewish communities that do self-legislate what are known as sumptuary laws, laws that limit how much people can spend on certain types of personal events, such as weddings, etc. Here, this is sort of the locus classicus, the basic source for this idea from Moed Katan 27a and b, a sequence of things introduced by Barishona at first or formerly, some state of affairs was the way it was. But when that state of affairs proved to be unsatisfactory for some reason, hitkinu, the sages instituted, the sages legislated that something else should be done. So here, what we're dealing with are a small series of these things having to do with the gap between the rich and the poor. Formerly, they were wont, I love this translation, to convey victuals, food to the house of mourning, the rich in silver and gold baskets, the poor in baskets of peeled willow twigs, and the poor felt ashamed. And this is Masechet Moed Katan, Tractate Moed Katan. So yes, we're talking about Avelut, about mourning. So the rich, it was silver and gold, the poor in wicker baskets, the poor felt ashamed. Therefore, the sages instituted, everybody gets wicker baskets. The food is going to be taken to the house of the Avel everywhere in wicker baskets. Formerly, they were served in drinks in the house of mourning. The rich, it would be these lovely, expensive white glass vessels. The poor, it would be colored glass. This way you could pour water in. It would look like wine. It wouldn't be wine, a nice purple glass. It looks like Cabernet, but it's not. And the poor felt shamed. Therefore, what did the sages do to alleviate the shame of the poor? Everybody gets the drinks served in the colored glass. Then flipping the page on page 6 at the top of the source sheet, something which is a little more poignant. Formerly, they were wont to cover the face of the rich and cover the face of the poor. This is of the deceased. Because their faces turn livid. The original language, heshchiru, they would sort of yellow, mipnei habatzoret, in times of drought. And again, the poor felt ashamed. The wealthy deceased looked healthy in death. The impoverished deceased looked particularly impoverished in death, and therefore, again, this unsatisfactory state of affairs was alleviated by the rabbis decreeing, instituting hitkino, that everybody's face should be covered. And again, how the deceased were brought out for burial, the rich on a dargesh, a more elevated type of conveyance that signified their social status, the poor on a plain bier, and again, out of respect for the poor, out of regard for the shame of the poor, the sages instituted that everybody should be brought out on a plain bier. And in the original, the recurring phrase is mipnei kvodan shel aniyim, because of the honor of the poor, the fact that the poor felt ashamed, and out of their kavod, in order to equalize them in this respect, in respect of mourning and death, to equalize the rich and the poor to some extent, the sages instituted these changes. And then the last one under the ellipsis on page 6 is also particularly poignant. Formerly, the expense of burial fell harder. The dead men's near of kin would abandon him. And again, Rabban Gamliel, who is a very wealthy person, very powerful, sort of the center of gravity of power and prestige in the world of Tanaitic Eretz Yisrael, the Tanaitic period at this time, disregarding his own dignity. He behaved in a way that signified a certain regard ultimately for the poor, and everybody else followed suit. And then, of course, in source 12, a number of people might from other contexts be familiar with this. I think around the 15th of Av, Facebook and other social media, people like to talk about this ancient practice. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, this is from the Mishnah and Tractate Ta'anit. There was no great, yontifs like the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur. Why? Shebahen banot Yerushalayim yotzot b'kli lavan she'ulin. The daughters of Jerusalem would get borrowed white clothes, would run outside. We'll leave aside why they were running. We'll leave that for Facebook on the 15th of Av. Shelo levayesh et mi she'ein lo. And again, the point is the clothing was simple and white. It was the clothing was shaul. It was borrowed. Again, shelo levayesh et mi she'ein lo. This was so the wealthier girls, the poorer girls, nobody would be able to figure out the socioeconomic status of the girls based upon what they were wearing, or based upon how they acquired what they were wearing. Everybody would borrow it, so it wouldn't be, oh, she bought the white thing for a load of money at blah.com, and this one had to go borrow it. No, they all borrowed it. The fourth strategy is one that I do find particularly interesting, and it's a tricky one. It's tricky. What I'm calling it the poor's religious obligations as Jews and as members of their communities. The reality is the Torah binds all Jews. All Jews are bound by the Torah. One question that I continue to ask myself is whether and to what extent these socioeconomic categories, whether grossly defined, wealthy and poor, or whether more precisely defined, how important are those to the rabbis? That's a question I ask, but what's clear is those differences can make no difference in terms of the fundamental obligation that all Jews have to observe the Torah. So hold that thought. I start here on page 6 with source 13, a couple of pull quotes from the late legal theorist Robert Cover, who among things that he wrote that are extremely thought-provoking on halakha, on Jewish law, on thinking about Jewish law from a theoretical lens, a literary lens even. He has an essay called Obligation, a Jewish Jurisprudence of the Social Order. On page 241, he points out, reflecting on the world of the halakha, one who acts out of obligation is the closest thing there is to a Jewish definition of completion as a person within the community. That, we can, perhaps argue about it. It's a good observation. It has, by the way, implications for a feminist reading of the Torah and Jewish tradition, but that is certainly above my pay grade today. Then the second quote on 242, 243, he talks about, notice, the mythic center of the law. The mythic center of the law has to reinforce the bonds of solidarity. The myth of divine commandment creates that web. And I bring Cover here just to point out that this, from a scholar who was reflecting on this as something that, he saw that cohesiveness, he saw that desire on the part of the sages of Jewish tradition to create this cohesive community in the role of obligation. It's a little more controversial, the issue of where, if at all, do rights fit in here. That's also work for another day. Rights per se are not entirely absent from the world of Torah, even though we have to define that very carefully, and we have to be very sensitive to how our sources themselves speak about them. But nevertheless, that centrality of obligation and the cohesive community created around it is something to keep in mind as we ponder this particular quote unquote strategy. The first subcategory here that I have on page 7 and 8 is what I call the poor's participation in the Jewish narrative. The Jewish narrative basically being how we are as Jews, what the story we tell ourselves. And of course, a primary place where that narrative comes from is the study of Torah. And in source 14, the Rambam and Hilchot Talmud Torah has a beautifully lyrical passage. Everyone is obligated. Again, he's talking about men. Everyone is obligated, whether poor or rich, able-bodied or afflicted, young or old. Even a poor person supported by tzedakah who goes door to door, even someone with family obligations, must fix a time for study. V'hagita yomam v'layla. In other words, if I could extrapolate a little bit, if you see a person who's impoverished sitting and studying, sitting with a book open, one isn't to say to him the way the guy in Leviticus Rabbah back on page 1 said, go get a job. This person may be involved in their fixed set time for the study of Torah, and everybody is obligated. Poverty is not a reason to exempt oneself from the study of Torah. Nor is it a reason to see people as exempt, to stop people from engaging in the study of Torah. Another place we see the Jewish narrative is, of course, with Pesach, with the Passover Seder. And that really is the subject there of sources 15, 16, and 17. 15 is the first Mishnah in chapter 10 of Masechet Psachim, that what happens there, lo yochal afilu ani shebi Yisrael, even a poor person of Israel, lo yochal ad sheyesev, should not eat until he reclines, v'lo yifchatu lo mi arba kosot shel yayin va'afilu min hatamchui. They should not, even the communal providers of sustenance to the poor, should not fail to give him the 4 cups. In other words, on an ordinary day, 4 cups of wine, depending on the local community and its standards, that may be a luxury, but no, this is necessary. The poor, no less than anyone else, must participate on the 15th of Nisan in the fundamental Jewish narrative of the Exodus from Egypt. They have to participate in this fully. And again, we see this in source 16. Even a person here, Rabbi Caro puts the obligation on the other foot in the Shulchan Aruch. Even the person who is supported from tzedakah, if they don't have enough, in other words, in order to acquire the needs of the Seder, Yimkor Malvusho, should do what is necessary in order to acquire this. Yes, it's interesting. Yes. And what about the former? Is there any reason to assume can't be bought from tzedakah? Yes, I think the latter, what you say, if the funds are not enough to cover the cost of wines, in other words, if the person hasn't been able to put together enough tzedakah in order to get the wine, they have to do what they have to do. I would say this is where it gets tricky, but something that also illustrates, and it's a point that I made, I think, a couple of weeks ago when an issue came up with tzedakah, is that the poor, these are religious obligations. The poverty is not, it's the good news and the not so good news. The good news is the poor and the rich are equal with respect to these religious obligations. The bad news is the reality of the world the way it is that the poor's ability to fulfill these obligations is going to be difficult. Either the poor is going to receive the means to do this through tzedakah, or if those means somehow fall short, the poor is going to have to straighten his own circumstances even more in order to do that. I would say the difference between this and the situation with the creditor and all of that is this is affirmatively doing these ritual obligations that are tied into the Jewish narrative. These are the things that make us Jews. The study of Torah, the Passover Seder, as we'll see when we flip the page, Hanukkah, also a narrative of redemption. Paying the creditor, this is a situation. Yes, of course, paying off your debts. The rabbis struggle to find how to make that a mitzvah. It is considered to be a mitzvah, but it's not the same sort of thing, because there the danger is that food will almost literally be taken out of the mouths of the dependents of the poor person. In source 17, I just wanted to point out the Mishnah Brura in the 19th or 20th century, just expressing shock. He says, "V'tamiheni al eza mikomot she'ein mashkichin al zeh." He says, I'm amazed about places that don't pay attention to this, that they're supposed to give poor people the 4 cups from the communal resources. Halo davar zeh pashut u'miboar b'kama poskim. This is so obvious that this is supposed to happen. He says, I'm shocked and amazed that this doesn't happen. And again, 18 and 19, I'll leave it to you all. We see the same thing here with the Hanukkah lights. And again, putting together these 3 mitzvot, Talmud Torah, Pesach, Hanukkah, we have elements here of the Jewish narrative. The poor is obligated to the Jewish narrative. The poor is not to be excluded on the grounds of lack of means from the Jewish narrative. Another area that I personally find interesting about this is the subcategory of this that I have on page 8 here about the wealthy, the poor, and providing financially for communal prayer. Basically, to make a long story, or not so long, but to make a story short, the idea is the same. The Shliach Tzibor fulfills the obligations of the poor and the rich. How do we pay the Shliach Tzibor? If we allow the shliach tzibor to be paid purely from private funds, there's something wrong about this. The shliach tzibor has to represent everyone equally. So the strategy that emerges is to have a sort of per capita assessment where everybody pays equally, which will, of course, probably not be adequate to actually support the shliach tzibor. And then, of course, there will be a different assessment, lefi mamon, according to ability to pay, in order to put together a living wage. But again, the point being that hashliach tzibor, I'm taking language now from source 20 on page 8, motzi hadal ka'ashir. He fulfills the obligation of the poor as well as the rich. We can't have a situation where the poor play absolutely no role in the financing of the shliach tzibor. That's not right. So again, it's not going to be adequate, but you have a per capita assessment, everybody contributes equally, and then on top of it, you'll have your assessment on the basis of ability to pay. And I just always think it's cute teaching in an institution where we have a terrific school of sacred music filled with people with wonderful voices, to see source 21 where the Taz says, look, people want to give to when the shliach tzibor has a lovely voice, when the kol is a rave. When the voice is lovely, what are we going to stop that? No, you want people, of course, they're going to want to give more. But again, you have the per capita assessment, so at least everybody participates equally. The next subcategory, I called it the poor's participation in creating a community of dignified, self-reliant people. I mean, the key here also is self-reliance. The first source, the Shulchan Aruch, source 22, draws this largely from the Rambam. In other words, try not to take. It's obvious that, yes, if you need tzedakah, take it, but try to do what you can not to have need of other people, invoking a well-known statement in the Talmud Bavli in Masechet Shabbat, Aseh Shabbat Chachol v'al titzarech labriot, make your Sabbath like a weekday, make your Sabbath a weekday and have no need of other people. I would say don't try this at home, don't take it literally. There is a tradition of interpretation around that. But the point is, try not to the extent that it's possible, try not to need tzedakah. So you're a poor sage, you don't think it's dignified for you to engage in a certain type of trade, engage in trade, do whatever you can not to need tzedakah if that's at all possible. Source 23, the Shulchan Aruch codifies halacha that is unquestioned, going back already to the Talmud Bavli. This is the dignified, self-reliant part. The poor has an obligation as well to see to the dignity of the larger Jewish community. Unless it's absolutely impossible, the poor person should not be taking tzedakah from non-Jewish sources. And then source 24, the recognition that tzedakah is a religious obligation. A poor person who subsists on charity, mitparnes min hatzedakah, ya'aseh tzedakah, must do tzedakah. Again, even if it's a matter of one person simply doing a trade and exchange with another, because it's, at the end of the day, a religious obligation. And then source 25, I will commend to you. It's part of the Rambam's painting of a picture that I've written about in other places, where the Rambam really has a vision for how the biblical principle, de machsoro, sufficient for a person's lack, how this is really kind of the basis of a Jewish social policy, that the point is to create the sort of Jewish society in which everybody has the means to live in a household in a dignified manner. So we will leave that for now. And again, sources 26 and 27, talking about the poor's own giving of tzedakah. The Shulchan Aruch in source 26, whoever is obligated, everyone is obligated to give tzedakah, afilu ani. Again, the poor has obligations as a member of the Jewish community, even if in source 27, if the person doesn't give, we don't require it. I mean, if the person doesn't give, we assume that they know their own situation better. But if they give, we certainly accept the pruta. The last of these so-called strategies is an odd one, which is part of the reason I left it for last, even though it's the oldest. It's an old theological idea. The rabbis and the Christians of late antiquity both inherit this idea from Second Temple Judaism, and arguably it's found in late strata of the Hebrew Bible, which are from the Second Temple period, the book of Daniel. The notion is called redemptive almsgiving, or in the more elegant Hebrew, tzedakah mechaperet, atoning charity. There were reasons I prefer the old inelegant redemptive almsgiving that we don't have to go into here. But the notion, and what makes it a strategy, is that as perhaps odd as moderns may find this notion, and it's the notion that giving charity to the poor results in the forgiveness of your sins, giving to the poor is a deposit into your heavenly bank of merits on which you can draw down as a later time. As uncomfortable, we don't matter. As uncomfortable as we find it, there's something very interesting about it, because it gives a certain dignity to the poor. The poor, and actually that idea was expressed most clearly by John Chrysostom, a church father who was no friend of the Jews, but he expressed that idea most clearly, that the poor, who seems to be the most despised, becomes the most important person of all. But rabbis, they have that idea of redemptive almsgiving. And if you think it's an idea that has gone away, it hasn't. For those of us who sadly have to recite Yizkor, one of the things in Yizkor, what do you say when you remember the deceased? Ani noder or noderet or bli neder, without taking a vow. I vow without taking a vow to give tzedakah on behalf of the deceased. That is a morphing of the notion of redemptive almsgiving. But what does the poor person say here in the bold? Zechibi. This is in Talmudic Eretz Yisrael. The poor person would say, Zechibi, acquire merit through me. Do yourself some good by giving to me. You're doing yourself as much, if not more good than you're doing to me. Izdakebi, be merited through me. Zechi garmachbi, acquire merit through me. In other words, the poor person, there's a certain equalization of circumstances in that the poor person, the transaction is, you're helping me in this world, I'm helping you in the next. Or you're helping me in this world, but I'm helping you in that if you deserve punishment in this life for something that you've done, by giving to me, you're putting a deposit in your heavenly bank, and maybe you'll be able to draw down on it and avert the punishment. So again, it may be odd to think of this as a quote unquote strategy for mitigating the us and them mentality, but in a sense, it is a kind of a strategy for mitigating the us and them mentality. So here you have it. I mean, there's certainly, as I hope people realize who may be listening today, who may have listened in previous weeks, who may be catching up on all three of the series, there is a great deal here. There is a great deal of rabbinic reflection on human experience. There's a great deal of wisdom. And what I also personally find very moving as well is a realization of how difficult things are. There are no easy solutions here. There are no easy answers to why there is poverty. There are no easy answers to how to alleviate poverty. There's no promise of some sort of utopian world prior to the Messianic era, where all of these problems can be solved. I mean, there is a grappling with a intractable, what's seen as an intractable human reality, and an attempt to create a Jewish society which is humane and which does not make these sorts of divisions fundamental to the way the community operates. And that's a wrap.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gray. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly going to be walking away thinking about a few things, especially with, today's looking at today's sources in light of other classes' sources and such. If anyone, it's been pretty quiet in the chat on Facebook, no questions there, but if anyone still on Zoom has questions, happy to turn them over to, please feel free to ask Dr. Gray. And if anyone who is watching who has a question and doesn't think of it until later, Dr. Gray, how can people get in touch with you?
I'm one of the easiest people in the world to find. My email's all over the place. You could email me at agray. I could drop it in the chat. agray@huc.edu, which is my work address at Hebrew Union College.
All right. Thank you very much. This is the last of 3 sessions. The recordings are available in our audio library and on our Facebook video archive and on our YouTube video archive. If you want to learn more with Drisha, we have classes starting up after Thanksgiving as part of our continued Fall Zman offerings. To find out more, please sign up at drisha.org/classes. Our next class will be tonight, Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, on the topic of slavery through Jewish eyes from the Hebrew Bible to rabbinic texts, where people have the pleasure of learning with Dr. Aviva Ben-Ur. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Take care, everyone, and have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.